Thank you, everyone. And thanks for those of you who've come back to join myself and co-lead Talia. Let's get Talia's camera on so we can see her. There's my co-lead, my co-conspirator, co-instigator.
It's not my fault. It's not my fault.
Yeah. So I may be a disembodied voice, but I'm here with you. Welcome back, and thanks for joining myself and co-lead Talia for this closing summary session. The purpose of this session is to identify and share some threads that have come out of these conversations that may become the research subjects, right? That we're going to be offering to the work sessions groups on day 2 to grapple with and come up with some ideas and some hypotheses. And that's going to be next Friday, December 10th. So if you signed up for a work group, and we hope that you have, you'll be able to get a sense of these research subjects as of tomorrow.
I mean, maybe it's worth a word on a slight reframing of this session. I think Cheryl and I were maybe slightly overambitious in the belief that in somehow 40 minutes, we could synthesize everything that had been discussed today, distill it into very clear research subjects that would then be the foundation of the work groups. I think thankfully and gratefully, the discussions and conversations today, I think, have stimulated far more than we can distill, despite our great capacities naturally. But yeah, so what we thought might be more interesting is actually just to open it up as a conversation between ourselves, which I hope you've gathered was really the spirit of the event, which was really to open a series of conversations and start to speculate. Not only about where we're at, but also where we're going. And in terms of the research subjects, what are the sort of blind spots or the dark spots or the conversations that have yet not been had that demand further exploration through really a collective project and a collective platform. So, when we talk about distilling the research subjects, it's really to seed and orient the work sessions that'll happen on December 10th. Wherein we hope also we will move a little bit out of the speculative conversation mode and really into more actionable hypotheses and proposals and ideas for the way in which these subjects can be explored both by institutions or other cultural agents. So rather than presenting the research subjects today, I think it's just going to be me and Cheryl really, I think, just jamming and hopefully with you as well. So thank you also to those of you that have stuck it out and have joined us for this session. It's been an intense day in all the best of ways. But we do open the chat space and the question and answer space to all of you to pipe in with your thoughts because again, so much was covered. And I think it's beyond us to determine which are the most salient topics. So we do hope you'll offer your input and participation on this as well.
Yeah. Just in terms of time brackets, Talia, because of the long day and the interpreters, we're going to close it off at around 5 minutes to 5. So that means that we won't have to dance around too long and hopefully, if there are some people that want to contribute, then there'll be enough time for that. So I want to know from you sort of what the threads have been that have really stuck out for you.
Okay. So in my 7 pages of notes, I've managed to extract a few. So I don't know if I'll run through them all. I'd like to hear from you too. Maybe we can do some back and forth. But in note form, I think one thing, or maybe, and these are in no particular order, really just extracted very quickly. I think, one of the ideas we set forth for ourselves as a framing idea was the notion of sustainability and what that could mean and the ways in which we even understand it now. What emerged for me today was an idea of the sustainability of change. One of the thoughts that seemed to recur was sort of the unbelievable inertia of our systems, of our society. And, though we feel like we're under and experiencing a radical shift, inertia is often a greater force than we realize and can often take hold even when change occurs. So the sustainability of change was one thought. I think a clear message too was the capacity for artists to really be the agents that are leading the way, and have always been. Artists have engaged in societal questions, have reflected and been critical of society and where we at and the contemporary moment. And I think maybe it's the time for institutions to start learning more from artists and allow them to really start leading us as we continue to navigate through these complex questions. I think, another note I made was sort of questions of plurality, and maybe kind of radical plurality, in the sense that, we talk a lot of sort of blanket terms were thrown out today, and we all recognize them, right? Accessibility, which underrepresented groups, but also the flattening of those underrepresented groups. We heard from Carmen, speaking about disabled people, and when you think about the range and complexity of the range of disabilities and what that represents, there's incredible degrees of nuance. So I also then thought about it in terms of institutions. We talked about institutions a lot. We also talked somewhat about cultural institutions, and we talked about art institutions. What do these mean? Then do we all have to share the same ambitions and missions? What if, we really come together to distinguish between a plurality of missions that might in fact sort of realize a collective effort in a much more successful way? And then, the counterpart to that was nuance. And again, how do we embrace nuance, the nuance of human condition, the nuance of underrepresented groups, or, the notion of indigenization was another one that was touched upon, right? These are sort of incredibly nuanced categories of considerations, and that I think we're only barely starting to recognize, let alone address in a meaningful way. So maybe I'll throw those 5 out there for a first session, but what did you think?
Yeah, I definitely, with sustainability being the core concern, what the first thing that shot out for me was the culture of care as being really kind of central to um, a meaningful sustainability. Because when we think about operating from an ethical standpoint, from thinking about, as Monica mentioned, treating people like family, and then also thinking about gratitude, how institutions, it's not the institutions that bestow relevance on, on culture, it's more the other way around. And so those things seemed like the big umbrella. And then all of these interconnected threads where we're, concerned with creating diverse and inclusive spaces for the public and also the people on staff, where we're deeply concerned with disability as culture. And that I'll forever be grateful to Carmen for instilling that thought. The imperative of recognizing the needs for practices to be concerned with the environment and carbon footprints. And Haley makes it, she comes at it in a way that actually makes it practical and even fun, because it's like, yes, we can do something. The digital and physical space seem to be another point of grappling, because the digital and the physical are, well, the digital is definitely something that we're still trying to navigate, also in terms of accessibility. And then there was the big one around power, shifting powers, hierarchies, accountability, the leadership question, but power also as it affects cultural workers, both inside and outside the institutions. Just thinking about how, the pandemic has really had a bearing on mental health and the mental health of cultural workers, especially in cultural institutions, and just how much is reasonable and sustainable, to put on the shoulders of cultural workers. Not only in the environment of pandemic, but in your everyday, program, it's like, are we doing too much? Are we asking for too much, too fast, and sort of too often? So that led to the last one that stuck out for me, which was the idea of going slower. The idea that we have been so conditioned by, sort of the capitalist mode of production to go to sort of march to the beat of industry and, sort of the corporatization of everything, pretty much everything. So, Carmen also said something that I really loved, which is, the human time signature, and that within, sort of, the culture of disability as culture, that there's another time signature that folks are vibrating to, and that made me think about the human time signature, and, maybe there's things to think about there. That's all I got.
Yeah. No, well, like there tons to riff on there. I think, just to speak to the culture of care, there's the humanness component, which is also to me a sort of its own subject. But just to, one thing I got thinking about was and it speaks also to maybe, so much intertwined, right? But I think one, reaction is the notion of institutions as both agents, right? And what they do and how they can imbricate and operate within a broader societal fabric, but then also institutions as enactors, right? That, we're enacting and replicating. And I think those are the two things, right? That they're, we have to kind of look at, reconcile, or think through, because they're different, right? What are we doing as institutions? Also, how are we operating as agents, and what's the potential there? But just, on that one, I remember, kind of an interesting comment about sort of a perversion that happened where, art institutions, and again, this is speaking to the notion of care, right? Care for what and care how. But the notion that somewhere along the way, institutions were created to care for art, and they actually became caretakers of art history, right? And then when you think about cultural institutions and sort of map the analogy there, right? I started thinking, so cultural institutions, maybe were originally mandated to care for culture, but actually now are caring for cultural history, and so how do we sort of undo those two things, right? Which speaks to the notion of sort of the canons of, the systems and authorities and such, and also, what's the distinction? I sometimes kept wondering, and we talked a lot about institutions, or institutions were spoken about, but then, what's the nuance when you break that down or apply it to specifically cultural institutions? And then what's the distinction there between cultural institutions and art institutions, right? And within all of those things, where does art lay? Because I think there's a problematic too that I get stuck on sometimes, which is, are we instrumentalizing art too much, right? Is art the mechanism for all these other things to take place, right? Or is fundamentally the mission, or should it be, of an art or cultural institution to be really centered on the art? Or is it through the art that all of these other things can be realized? Or is there sort of a whole other order, mandate, and responsibility that institutions need to take on?
I have a lot I could say about. Hello, am I on? Okay, sorry. There's a lot I could say about that, and I think we'll definitely have that opportunity, right? Next Friday. I thought maybe I would bring Laurence Dubuc's, comment to the. I think everyone's seen it, right? It seems to me that it would be helpful to anchor our reflection on sustainability within a broader conversation about the ontological nature of precarity. Bodies are not eternal, nor is the land. What kind of sustainability can we hope for in light of the climate crisis, deadly migration processes of racism and discrimination? And what can art institutions do to engage with this? I mean, this is, you've, encapsulated. I think Laurence has encapsulated it very well. Just how all of these things are interrelated, interconnected, and, how do we kind of, do we pick them apart? Do we take them, as a kind of braid, but
Well, also, what do we want to endure? Right. Like, I think that, like, to get apocalyptic for a second, right? thank you, Laurence, for the fairly apocalyptic portrait of our future, which I like to deny on a daily basis. But I think it's a real maybe question, right? And it speaks to maybe the question of, to me, there's a twin, right, of that sort of confrontation that Andres spoke of, our own essentialness, right? We fit, institutions, we sort of felt, we were really playing a fundamental role within society, and then boom, sort of catastrophe happens, and we're deemed non-essential, whereas hardware stores and, are, and I think that confrontation and the question of relevance, speak to that, right? I mean, if everything else goes away, what is the thing that will endure? And have we done our part to support that very thing, and maybe that's where, the kind of humanness comes in, right? At a fundamental level, I think that the reckoning that's happened maybe most universally, right, is sort of one, the vulnerability, but also the nature of our own humanness and the need for connection, right, which I think, sort of wove its way through many of the conversations in different ways. But, I have, Jeb Chomba's comment sort of still ringing in my head, kind of our institutions, the spaces within which we can feel more human in. Right. And if that's maybe the fundamental mission, that then we can break down, in all sorts of different ways, in the way that art relates to that, and what is art as a sort of condition of humanness or a purveyor of humanness through the ages, that we are the custodians of. Maybe that's a way to think about it.
What's interesting about what you're saying is that throughout the day, invariably, these ideas about it being about one very simple thing seem to be the nugget. We make things. I mean, things are complex. We can make things complicated, but if we come at it, seemed to me that everyone was talking about coming at it from the land, from the place and the people. And when we start from those sort of central, when we make that central, then the rest of the care and how to be human with each other, how to make spaces that are human, and also make kind of acknowledging, I think also the non-human. I think Haley had talked about that, sort of the the
96% of animal mass on the planet.
Exactly, that it doesn't, it can't, we can, I really believe that we can address these things when you just distill it down to something really simple and fundamental. And address the awareness of the dynamics of power that make things, right, hierarchical and complex, and who gets and who doesn't get, etc.
Right. Well, that's maybe it's an interesting notion, because it is sort of the simplest idea, right? Like just a space of humanness, but maybe it's the simple thing that can encompass the complexity and the plurality of what we're talking about. There's many, humanness is not all wonderful,
right?
It's also distorted and
it's messy. And I
ugly.
think that was the other thing that probably, we would kind of get to, is that messiness needs to be embraced.
I do want to, the plurality thing, there were just a few other, it just triggered a few of my other reflections, which, there was a notion too of sort of art world, capital A, right? But then the notion that, and how do we kind of embrace more, or how do we become more diverse? How do we sort of subvert that art world? When in fact, I think a comment was made with, yes, there's that art world, but there's actually also many, many more, that are existing in parallel that we haven't even, that are just operating on their own terms. And I think, it even, connects the idea of, trying to outreach to communities. There's communities who don't want to be part of the institution, don't want to visit the institution, but, that doesn't mean that they're not also participating in an art world of their own, right? Where creativity and creative expression and social commentary, whatever, all the fundamental bases of an art world, maybe with less of the nastier parts maybe live, right? And I think if we start to recognize those, we might be playing an institutional role, in support and recognition, not necessarily in sort of emulation or encompassing or reaching or pulling in or, sort of trying to sort of consume other creative zones of creative production, but rather simply recognizing them. And then through that, sort of dispersing the power structure in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah, we talked a little bit too about that, right? The monolithicness. I guess that was in Androsh and Yosomi's and Ken's exchange.
Mhm.
The tanker, right? This how these how monolithic cultural institutions have been extremely slow to change.
Yeah, that was such an, it's that one I'm grappling with too, right? Because on the one hand, there was sort of, a compelling case made for slowness, as you touched on. But on the other
But not that kind
hand,
of slowness.
yeah, exactly, yeah, exactly. Sort of slowing things down to a pace of sort of absorption and,
Right.
and realness, right? But on the other hand, kind of the insane inability to turn the ship,
Yeah.
the super tanker, right? That this,
Because the super tanker is sort of used to having this authoritarian role,
yeah,
gatekeeping, and sort of the authority on what is sort of cultural capital,
yeah.
Yeah.
Cultural capital, another one. I mean, one got me thinking a lot. Again, is it, sort of cultural capital simply, again, a sort of appropriation of a financial term that's part of our sort of neoliberal capitalist society, or is it a real parallel universe? Are we actually operating within, an entire parallel universe of capital culture that actually in its independence might have power we haven't even recognized yet, right? And my questions were going, like, is it necessarily tethered to financial capital? Is cultural capital a system unto itself? Does it have relevance if, financial capital fell away, if the economy fell away, if we, moved out of an entire economic system or order, as was suggested, in return to a barter system, would cultural capital still exist? And I guess that was sort of another riff, kind of, the parallel universes, right? And I think too that spoke to me, Caleb, the Black Swan work that's being done.
Yeah.
Really interesting, right? I mean, is there an entire parallel universe of creative and artistic production or new models of power dynamics, creative, artist-led methodologies, that could emerge? And then also the other one that sort of that one pinged off to was sort of the digital, right? Because we didn't delve too much into it today, but like every time we talked about digital, Andres mentioned it too, that sort of, one, obviously institutions were forced into, many, and some not, some mothballed, but, many had to sort of start to explore digital space and what that could mean. But I was thinking too, I mean, like with the metaverse and, like, and I was remembering too, to a conversation that we had with, some of the folks at the Manchester International Festival who, have done some interesting work in terms of virtual spaces and digital spaces. And, they were saying that just, they tapped, first of all, institutionally, right? There was no support, right, to sort of venture into these territories in a meaningful way. And then, like, in so doing, they tapped into an audience that was massive, that was way beyond the people that were coming physically to their spaces or to the
Right.
festival or such,
Right.
and so, sometimes I wonder too, is there this whole other parallel universe that we, we're just so slow to recognize, like we think that, we're expanding into the digital world, in the digital space, like that's a highly sophisticated universe. It's, the meta universe is real, I think, and, and we better catch up, I think, and start to understand it. And but then I circle back to the humanness, right? And again, this might be a generational lag.
Yeah.
Like, but humanness is in like the togetherness, right? But maybe not. Maybe not, and maybe, and that's the other, sorry, I'm just saying, this is the matrix of thoughts, but in terms of who are the disruptors that could lead the way forward, right? Artists were mentioned, but I think also there's just sort of the next generation, right? Those communities that don't want to come to the institution, well, where are they going, right? I mean, if we believe that there's a fundamental need to connect with each other, to connect with art, to create, to connect with creativity in a fundamental way that's part of our humanness, then where is that being fulfilled? And does the institution have a role to play in terms of accessing or partaking?
What the last, well, that gets me back to thinking about the last panel, with Richard and Ella Scalinati and Yasmina around imagination. Well, Jeff Shumpa's question, like, how do we imagine these things? And that was a really beautiful way, I think, to return agency to all of us, to really invest in imagination again. And in the early days when we were talking about this, sessions, we were talking about how do we create a space to dream, and how do we allow ourselves to, fortify, a cultural milieu for everyone. And so maybe that might be another thread somehow, in some way.
It makes me think I won't be able to conjure the source of the quote, but it was related. It was an economist, I think, who said it. But and he was saying that sort of systemic change is only possible to the extent of what we can imagine, right? And so like economic collapse, sort of escaping capitalism is just almost and it was funny because Kunadi almost sort of echoed that, right? She was like, I was trying to imagine like what it would mean not to have money, right? Like, if we no longer had financial capital in our world, what would it be? And it's very difficult to imagine, right? It's actually but if we push ourselves, right, is that actually the mechanism, in an inverted way, right? That's through sort of pushing the imagination that actually starts to sort of push the boundaries of what's actually possible for change, right? Because I think that was another resonating point, was that we cannot do it alone. There's no institution, there's no academic institution that can operate or really, which I'm curious what you think about, because Richard sort of made the comment in the last session, just, that it's almost impossible to sort of operate, it was in the context of an academic institution, right? But to sort of to enact a change when you're actually so fundamentally connected to sort of a broader system that just isn't changing, or is changing extremely slowly, like, is there any hope, right? And then you start to extrapolate and it's sort of a dismal picture.
Oh yeah, we're in deep. We're in really deep. And sometimes I'm like, tear down and rebuild, like rip that thing out. But I just I don't know how really productive that is, how to, turning that ship around in the, this Panama Canal or whatever, like, but something definitely to think about. I'm aware of time, and we should wrap it up, but I want to address some of the questions that are about the work groups, because there's concerns about the work groups.
Okay, great.
So
I do want to leave on one bit because it relates also to the work
Sure.
group, but I think the one also very compelling idea that came out of it, and I think it speaks also to the spirit of what we were hoping to achieve with the 5 sessions, is the notion of cultural institutions as epicenters for experimentation, for new models, for new modes, right? I think actually that might be a very interesting lead on the role that institutions can play, right? That, if it's sort of too massive a project, right, where are those centers where, research and development and experimentation can happen, right? That sort of connect to sort of the many dimensions of and complexities of society, but yet do so in a sort of microcosm that's somewhat manageable, right? That somehow can lead to sort of, results in a way that could be applicable or extended to broader systems. And I think that one's a super interesting one, and maybe a nice segue to talk about the work groups,
Yeah,
because I think so maybe just to quickly preface, right?
I think because Emily had a question about, do you have to have formed a work group with only the people that were in this forum today? And the answer is no. You can form a work group with anybody, 3 to 5 people. Suggested. If that's not possible, you can contact us and we can help, kind of group people together, because there are a few folks who have just said, I can't get folks together, I'd love to join. So like Sada, we would do that for you too. Or maybe Sada and Emily can join together. So, you should reach out to each other, or we'll help you do that. And you can sign up for to be a work group up until up until December 7th. So you've got time to get organized. What will happen then is you sign up a work group, you assign like a representative, or contact person, and then we're going to have a little session, like half an hour on December 8th, morning, to just kind of give you a little orientation on how you might lead your own self-directed work session. And we're going to be sending out, it could be a little bit of a laundry list of these research subjects that you can choose from. You can choose one, you can choose however many you want to like delve into in your own work session. So if there's other questions, just let us know.
Yeah, it may be worth adding also that following today, the sessions, the recordings have all the sessions were recorded and will also be put online. So also if you wanted to share any of the sessions or any of the content with friends or colleagues that you think might be interested to participate in a work group with you, they'll be available through all the way, for forever on, and certainly before next week. It's
Exactly.
also maybe also just to kind of give a bit of an indication of how we see the work groups flowing, is that really, like we said, it's sort of to now, sort of tackle these research subjects through identifying hypotheses, right? And then hypotheses that could lead to actionable proposals or ideas about how we could actually explore or materialize, prove or disprove those hypotheses. And then in so doing, sort of further our knowledge and awareness of that research subject. So that's sort of the spirit of what those work groups
That's
are.
it. It's like ongoing. It doesn't end after that work group day. We want to publish these things and keep the ideas flowing and keep people coming up with stuff and feeding into this sort of digital space that we want to create. Okay. Thank you, Talia.
Thank you,
for
Cheryl.
being my co-conspirator here. On behalf of our founder and director, our deepest gratitude to all our speakers today, to our live interpreters, Stephen Godet, Miriam Heap-Lalonde, and Jelena Holland, to our QSL interpreters, Karine Gauthier and Lynn Willette, and thank you to our ASL interpreters, Brooke Nanskeville and Liz Scully. Sorry, I meant to say on behalf of our founder and director, Phoebe Greenberg. Also, massive gratitude to our colleagues who have worked so hard to make this event happen. Victoria Carrasco, Kevin Delaney, Dahlia Cheng, Amelia Mercero-Wong, Marie-France Simard, Marie-Hélène Lemaire, Sabrina Purdy, Marie-France Barbier, George Bach, Frédéric Ségard, Danielle Fizet, Thomas Hirsch, Vincent Lafrenière, and Scarlett. Oh my God, Martinez. Thank you all for joining day 1 of 5 sessions, and we hope to see many of you back next week for day 2. Bonne soirée. Good evening.